I want to tell you about a phone call that happened last month between two very senior officials in Washington. One works at the Treasury Department, the other at the State Department. I can't tell you their names, but I can tell you what was said because it reveals something extraordinary about the world we're living in now. The Treasury official had just finished reviewing some economic data when he picked up the phone and said, "We have a problem. India just processed more digital transactions last quarter than our entire banking system handles in 6 months. And they did it with 0 transaction fees." There was a long pause on the other end. Then the State Department official replied, "That's impossible. India's GDP is a fifth of ours." "That's exactly the point," came the response. "The rules we thought governed economic development, they don't apply anymore. India is writing new ones." That conversation haunts me because it captures something that Washington's foreign policy establishment refuses to acknowledge. While America has been obsessing over China, treating Beijing as the singular threat to American hegemony, another giant has been quietly rising, not through military confrontation or economic warfare, but through something far more dangerous to American supremacy: pure innovation. And the most terrifying part for Washington: this new superpower is a democracy, which means all the tools America typically uses to contain rising powers simply don't work. Let me take you inside the numbers that should have been front-page news but somehow got buried beneath stories about trade wars and military buildups. In 2024, India's economy grew 8.2%, not the 2.1% that America managed, not the 5% that China achieved, but 8.2% sustained growth in an economy that already spans 1.4 billion people. But growth rates fluctuate. What doesn't fluctuate is the scale of transformation happening behind those numbers. India added 11 million people to its workforce last year. 11 million. That's like adding the entire population of Belgium to your labor force in 12 months. I need you to understand what this means in human terms, because the spreadsheets and economic projections miss the real story. There's a woman in Bangalore who graduated with a computer science degree 3 years ago. Today, she's leading a team that builds artificial intelligence systems for American Fortune 500 companies. The work is done in India, the servers are in India, the intellectual property is Indian, but the clients are in New York and Silicon Valley. 10 years ago, she would have needed to emigrate to reach her potential. Today, the world comes to her, and she's not alone. India produces 1.5 million engineers every year. That's more than America, Europe, and Japan combined. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. This isn't just about individual success stories or impressive statistics. This is about watching a nation systematically break every assumption that has governed American foreign policy for the past 30 years. The assumption that technological innovation requires Western education, broken. The assumption that financial infrastructure needs American oversight, shattered. The assumption that rising powers must choose between alignment and confrontation, completely obsolete. Let me tell you about something that happened in my own experience that opened my eyes to how far behind Western thinking has become. Last year, I was invited to speak at a conference in Mumbai about digital currencies and financial inclusion. I expected to find a developing economy struggling to catch up with Western innovations. Instead, I found a payment system so advanced that it made European banking look primitive. A vegetable seller showed me how she accepts payments through a simple QR code printed on paper. No expensive terminals, no monthly fees, no processing delays, instant settlement, complete transaction history, automatic integration with her tax filings. I asked her when she'd learned to use this system. She laughed and said, "Sir, this is how we've always done business. The rest of the world is learning from us now." That moment crystallized something I'd been sensing but hadn't fully grasped. India isn't rising by copying Western models. They're creating new models that work better than anything the West has produced. And other countries are starting to notice. Singapore adopted India's digital payment infrastructure. So did the UAE. France is implementing it. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Mauritius, all moving to Indian-designed systems. For the first time in modern history, developing nations are setting technological standards that developed nations follow. This represents a fundamental shift in how innovation flows around the world. For centuries, ideas moved from the wealthy center to the developing periphery. Now they're moving in the opposite direction, and Washington has no framework for understanding this reversal, let alone responding to it. The Pentagon still thinks in terms of military threats and defense spending. The State Department still thinks in terms of alliances and containment. The Treasury still thinks in terms of sanctions and financial pressure. None of these tools work against a democracy that's innovating faster than you are while maintaining neutrality in your conflicts. India's response to the Ukraine war perfectly illustrates this new reality. When Russia invaded, America demanded that every nation choose sides, condemn Russia, join sanctions, cut ties. India refused. They abstained in UN votes, increased oil purchases from Russia, and continued defense cooperation with Moscow. In the old world order, this would have triggered consequences: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, threats of isolation. Instead, America quietly accepted Indian independence because they need India to balance China. India demonstrated that being too important to alienate is more valuable than being closely aligned. This is what multipolarity actually looks like in practice. Not a world divided into competing blocs, but a world where major powers pursue their own interests while maintaining relationships with everyone. India trades with China while competing with China. They cooperate with America on some issues while rejecting American pressure on others. They buy Russian oil while participating in Western technology initiatives. This pragmatic non-alignment terrifies Washington because it makes India impossible to control or predict. You can't threaten someone who has multiple options. You can't pressure someone who's too valuable to lose. You can't ignore someone who's too large to sideline. And India is getting larger every day. Their population surpassed China's last year. By 2050, they'll have 1.67 billion people, while China's population shrinks to 1.3 billion. India will have the world's largest workforce, largest consumer market, most engineers, most young people, most soldiers. Demographics is destiny in economics. China grew powerful through demographic advantage, but their workforce is aging and shrinking. America maintains power through technological and financial dominance, but those advantages are eroding as other nations innovate. India combines demographic growth with technological innovation and political independence. That combination is historically unprecedented. I've been studying the rise and fall of great powers for decades, and I've never seen anything quite like what's happening in India. Previous rising powers either challenged the existing order directly, like Germany in the early 20th century, or integrated into it, like Japan after World War II. India is doing neither. They're building parallel systems that compete with Western institutions without directly confronting them. Their digital payment infrastructure rivals the Western banking system without needing to destroy it. Their space program achieves the same goals as NASA at 1/10 the cost without claiming technological superiority. Their manufacturing sector grows rapidly without triggering the same security concerns that Chinese manufacturing created. This approach is strategically brilliant because it avoids the trap that previous rising powers fell into. They're not threatening enough to justify containment, but they're not subordinate enough to accept direction. They occupy a middle space that renders traditional great power competition irrelevant. The clearest example of this strategy came during the recent tensions between India and Canada. When Canada accused India of extrajudicial killing on Canadian soil, the old American playbook would have demanded forceful support for a close ally. Instead, America made quiet diplomatic noises while India expelled Canadian diplomats and faced essentially no consequences. Why? Because alienating India would push them closer to China and Russia, because America needs Indian cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, because India is too strategically important to antagonize over any single issue, no matter how serious. That's not the behavior of a superpower in control. That's accommodation to a rising power that you cannot afford to lose. But the most revealing aspect of America's India problem is how rarely it gets discussed in Washington policy circles. China dominates every strategic conversation. Russia commands enormous attention. Iran, North Korea, even smaller powers like Venezuela receive regular analysis. India, despite being the world's fastest growing major economy and most populous nation, barely registers in American strategic thinking. This blindness isn't accidental. It reflects the inability of American foreign policy to process a reality that doesn't fit their established categories. Democratic nations are supposed to align with America. Authoritarian nations can be contained. Rising powers must choose between accommodation and confrontation. India breaks all these rules by being democratic but non-aligned, rising but non-confrontational, powerful but unpredictable. American strategists literally don't have a playbook for dealing with a power like India, so they largely ignore it and hope the problem resolves itself. This is perhaps the most dangerous miscalculation in contemporary American foreign policy. Because India isn't going away. Current trajectories suggest their economy will reach $10 trillion by 2035, $30 trillion by 2050 in purchasing power terms. They'll be a genuine economic superpower simply through size and momentum. They'll dominate the Indian Ocean, lead coalitions of developing nations, set standards in technology and governance that much of the world adopts, and they'll do all of this while maintaining strategic autonomy. They won't align with America against China. They won't align with China against America. They'll pursue Indian interests, regardless of what Washington or Beijing prefer. This is Washington's nightmare scenario. Not a hostile superpower that can be opposed, but an independent superpower that must be accommodated. A rising power that doesn't need permission and won't accept direction. The phone call I mentioned at the beginning captures this perfectly. Two senior American officials discovering that the world has changed in ways they didn't expect and don't understand. That India is setting new rules while America is still playing by old ones. The question isn't whether India becomes a superpower. The demographics and economic trajectory make that inevitable. The question is whether American foreign policy can adapt to a world where New Delhi makes decisions based on Indian interests rather than American preferences. And watching Washington's response so far, I'm not optimistic. They're too focused on China to notice India's rise. Too committed to maintaining primacy to accept genuine multipolarity. Too wedded to Cold War thinking about alignment and confrontation to engage pragmatically with a power that transcends both categories. A new superpower has emerged, and Washington never saw it coming because they were looking in the wrong direction. The world order that emerges over the next 2 decades will be shaped as much by decisions made in New Delhi as by those made in Washington or Beijing. That's the reality America needs to face. But watching their policy debates, I suspect they won't until it's far too late to influence the outcome.